We welcome today to Giamidis Money Honey Mr. Jeremy O'Friel from New York, founder and managing director of Belmont Investments. The objective of the discussion is to express a view on major issues surrounding the world economy. Topics to note are the effect of the US security blanket in the Middle East and what it means for the US dollar, the inflationary outlook as energy supply takes time to catch up, Asia moving more towards China given their greater predictability. The presentation is for information only and does not constitute invitation to invest. Καλωσορίζουμε σήμερα στο Giamidis Money Honey τον Jeremy O'Friel από τη Νέα Υόρκη, ιδρυτή και διευθύνων σύμβουλο της Belmont Investments. Θα συζητηθούν φλέγοντα θέματα όπως επίδραση στο αμερικανικό δολάριο τυχόν αποτυχίας προστασίας των συμμάχων των ΗΠΑ, πληθωριστικές τάσεις σαν αποτέλεσμα του χρόνου που χρειάζεται για να επανέλθει η παραγωγή ενέργειας στα επίπεδα που ήταν, πιθανή μετακίνηση της Ασίας προς την Κίνα που διακρίνεται με περισσότερη προβλεψιμότητα. Η παρουσίαση είναι μόνο για πληροφόρηση και δεν αποτελεί πρόσκληση για επένδυση.
Γεια σας. Today we welcome to Giamidis Money Honey Jeremy O'Friel from New York, who is keen to discuss the current issues surrounding the dollar situation, the American protection of the Middle East, the possible moving of Asia to China, plus many other financial topics. I would like to highlight that Jeremy was a guest again exactly a year ago when he was in Cyprus. Today he's talking from New York. Jeremy, welcome to Giamidis Money Honey.
Thank you very much, Kostas. Always a pleasure to be with you.
So, what is the most important financial issue that is conquering the news at the moment and the experts' views and predictions? What is your? We will value very much to hear your views. Starting with the most important thing for you, which is what?
Inflation.
Inflation.
Inflation is the most important thing. Inflation, and obviously its relationship with the price of money, which is, as we know, a very strong relationship. Certainly, I think that the years after the financial crisis, I think, made the financial world, a little bit complacent about interest rates. And Kostas, you're a little bit older than me, but we both remember a time in Western developed economies when interest rates were
20 plus, yes.
Yeah.
Rise in the price of oil again. Yeah.
Right. And so certainly the current crisis or military intervention or whatever you want to call this American adventure into Iran, the biggest impact and the biggest topic for discussion is its impact on inflation. There can be no doubt that what is happening in the Middle East is having an impact on inflation and will continue to have an impact on inflation for quite a long time to come. So even if an agreement is signed tomorrow, I think there's a very important distinction between the tariffs or the threatened tariffs of April 2025 and the military incursion of March 2026, namely that tariffs can be just turned off, Kostas, whereas undelivered oil cannot be suddenly delivered overnight.
Yes.
So you need to catch up. And so there is this assumption that if the war ends, that the price of energy will fall quickly. And I don't believe that, because I think that, for one thing, every sovereign nation in the world who has had an oil reserve, as many have, will be looking to replenish that and even boost that as a first point of business. So I think there's going to be upward pressure on energy prices for a long time to come.
Would that include the USA as well, or would USA be immune from inflation? It would be a miracle if it is immune. Of course it will include, but some people in the States think that it will not affect them.
And their assumption comes from this idea that because America produces so much oil, that America, in inverted commas, has enough oil. I think what they forget is that there is no state-owned American oil company. Yeah. So unlike Pemex in Mexico, PDVSA in Venezuela, Aramco in Saudi Arabia, Petronas in Malaysia, Petrobras in Brazil, these are all nationalized oil companies. There is no equivalent in the United States. Instead, you have independent profit-seeking companies who will independently seek profit they will maximize their profits on the global market. So they're under no obligation to ensure that their oil production stays in the United States. Now, maybe you can argue that Congress could pass some kind of legislation, which I believe they've done in the past during wartime, for example, kind of an Emergency Powers Act to restrict oil exports and natural gas exports. I think, though, that you're getting into very dangerous ground in relation to your relationship with corporate America, and also in relation to your standing as an investment center for the world, because you're becoming very interventionist if you start doing that. For example, if they start restricting the export of energy, are they also going to start restricting the export of food? And if so, are we moving towards a centrally planned economy, which is anathema to Americans politically? Any kind of sense of central planning is something that they're viscerally opposed to, Costas, as you well know. So no, they're not going to be immune. And we've already seen, as you know, we saw the inflation number yesterday, 3.8% annualized. That's not a good number. No. And it's not a good number when you consider that that was the month of April. We're not long into this war, and I don't see the situation getting any better. Costas, we don't trade spot markets, but we trade futures markets. And certainly, as you know, the futures markets in energy prices are only rising. So now, again, one argument I hear against this pessimism is that everybody said that the tariffs would cause enormous inflation, and they didn't. Well, we have to remember that a lot of the tariffs were backed down from. So they were announced loudly, and then they were reduced quietly. Yeah. So the tariffs were never as big as they were threatened to be.
With rising energy costs, we're really talking about a serious threat to the standard of living of people. Comparing in the 70s, when the rates of interest were 20 plus because of the huge inflation rate, then most of the people were not overborrowed as they are now. The societies have changed. The banks are going to be in trouble because they have lent so much money. The people who borrowed will not be able to the new rates of interest. It's going to be a much nastier situation than then. Of course, if you have deposits, you get 20% rate of interest on deposit, you are okay. Normally, these situations do not affect the wealthy people. It's strange, isn't it? They affect the bulk of the population who will suffer. And was it a good reason for it to happen? I mean, how did we find ourselves in such a situation out of the blue? Was it not a better way of achieving the same results? Now you'll tell me what results. We haven't seen any results yet. Interesting times. Yes, I agree. Inflation is going to be the major problem. And how do you cope with huge rates of interest, very high rates of interest, when people are overborrowed, something that they were encouraged to do?
Yeah. Look, I have a I have lots of concerns. I mean, inflation and interest rates is the source concern, but there are other tributaries. For example, the private credit markets, in which an awful lot of money is invested. Government debt levels in the Western economies in the United States, which are historically very high. We've already seen political strain in Western democracies, everywhere from the United Kingdom, France, Bulgaria, United States, obviously, where the inability of government to deliver on public services because of austerity, because of the aftermath of the financial crisis, has pushed politics. I wouldn't say, Costas, it's even been pushed to the right or the left. It's been pushed to populism. And in some cases, that populism is left-wing, in some cases, it's right-wing. But certainly, it has pushed politics towards populism. My concern there is populism in and of itself, I think, is based on the idea that there are, if you'll forgive me, easy solutions for difficult problems. And there are never easy solutions to difficult problems. And I worry that an awful lot of the political momentum is with candidates who have never governed before and who, once they get into power, I don't think they're going to do a particularly good job, because the simple solutions that they propose are not going to be particularly good for the people. So all of this comes back from an inflationary environment that was not terrific anyway, even before February the 28th. So inflation was stubborn before February 28th, whereas now it's not good at all. A 3.8% figure is not good, and psychologically, if we were to hit 4% in the next couple of months, which is very possible, that becomes concerning. And you mentioned before the price of gas, or sorry, the impact on Americans and whether or not they'll be immune. I can tell you that I live in the United States, and it's a very common topic on news channels every night. The price of gas is, 50% higher than it was 6 or 8 weeks or 10 weeks ago. So already the Americans are not immune. And as you know, the price of gas, whatever about putting it into your car, it's also going to affect the price of food at some point in the very near future, particularly with diesel prices going the way they're going, and with so much of the agricultural sector dependent on diesel as opposed to gasoline, traditional gasoline. So
do you envisage the inflationary pressures to include property prices? Or because it's going to be an economic disaster, people will feel poorer, so prices may go down? I mean, what do we mean by inflation? What do we include? Prices have gone up in property everywhere nowadays. Do we expect them to go up because of high energy costs? Yes, it costs more to build, but would people be able to buy them? Another interesting question.
It's very interesting, but certainly in the United States, we have it's a difficult market to read because it's very much frozen. There's very few transactions in the property market in the United States. Now, a lot of that cost us is a function of the fact that certainly in the US, if you sell a house and buy another house, you've got to get a new mortgage. And the mortgage you took out 4 or 5 years ago is most likely at much lower interest rates than a house that you buy. So there's a real reluctance for Americans to do anything other than just stay where they are. So I think it'll be very difficult to know if property prices are going up or down because there isn't much liquidity. There isn't many transactions in the property markets. Certainly, I would think, though, that on balance, the pressure is going to be downward in that interest rates drive property prices inversely. And again, you alluded to the fact that the cost of construction will go up because of energy prices. I can't imagine it's going to be good for the property market now.
No. And the fact that USA is still the military power in the world, does that protect the dollar from depreciating against other currencies? or it has nothing to do with that? Do you expect the US dollar to lose or to gain? Against what? Against the euro, against the sterling, against the Chinese?
There's two parts to that. There's two answers to that question. There's the question about US military power, and there's the question about the US dollar in isolation. Costas, in my opinion, the US dollar is kind of like the English language, meaning that, you speak English, I speak English, neither of us are English. But the English language, through the growth and prosperity of the British Empire, became the common language of the world, even though the British Empire is no longer with us. And I suspect the English language will be the dominant language of the world for both of our lifetimes. I think the US dollar is similar in that it has become the dominant currency independent of American influence. So, for example, some company in Bolivia doing business with a company in Mongolia, they might not trust each other's currencies, and therefore the agreement will be written in dollars. So actually, I don't expect the US dollar to decrease in value, to depreciate, but it's not because I have any great belief in American soft power or hard power. It's because the dollar has, through the last 85 years, become the dominant currency in the world. And that is a very difficult phenomenon to end, because the dollar is so inextricably linked with international business. I can't think of a country that doesn't borrow some of its debt in dollars, for example.
Yes.
And so as a result, no, I don't see the dollar depreciating, but I certainly see American economic power, bargaining power diminishing, given that one of their greatest tools, which is the military security that they can provide, that has been proven to be not very effective in the Middle East. And so if I was the ruler of a Middle Eastern country, who historically I have done business with the United States for various reasons, but one of those reasons being the American security blanket, I'd be looking at the world today and saying, well, that security blanket didn't really do much for me. And, I'm thinking about countries like Dubai, who, even though they're doubling down on their American relationship right now, they must be rethinking why exactly we're doing business with America. The Emiratis buy American weapons, they host American military bases, and they must be wondering what they're getting in return, because that blanket isn't working today as we speak. And I suspect other countries in the region are thinking the same thing. What's the point of spending all this money on F-35s from the US if the greatest threat is a $30,000 drone built in somebody's basement in Iran?
We are saying these things, but what is the alternative for the Middle Eastern countries and the Asian countries? Is China ready to take over from the States? It has taken over in many respects, technological respects, from Europe certainly, but currency-wise and language-wise. So we may say that there's still some time to go before we see a great movement away from USA, from dollars, because of these reasons. It's a common currency. It's used as a common denominator. But we need to remember, of course, 20 years ago, the then president of the United States, I think, said, it's our currency and your problem. I don't know if you remember that expression, but things have changed. So what is the way out?
Well, you see, I think there's three sources of power. There's economic, military, and political. And I think they tend to, each source of power creates more in the other types, meaning that American military power improves its economic influence because it can sit down with NATO countries and get very good terms economically because of the military power that they provide in protecting Europe. Now, I think one of the many terrible mistakes that the current administration is making is that they're forcing European countries, particularly France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, but others also, to beef up their own military. Now, when that happens, the next time, let's say in 5 or 10 years' time, where the Germans have a much more powerful military, which they will do,
Yes.
when they sit down for economic negotiations with the Americans, there's far less motivation for the Germans to give because they no longer need the American security blanket. They have their own security blanket. And we're starting to see the same from countries like Canada, for example, where the Canadians are starting to think about a security policy and defense policy that is far less dependent on the United States. Being needed is a very powerful negotiating tool. If the Americans make themselves less needed, it's not going to be good for their economic negotiations.
Yes. In fact, international trade will suffer a lot if the Americans withdraw to USA all their overseas expansions so far, because they believe in this way they give employment to the residents of USA. They are killing the international trade, which was based on a very simple principle. You go and produce where it is cheaper. Now we are missing that. So each producer will each country will try to produce in its own fields. So gone is the international trade advantage. What do you think?
No, I agree. And I think that international order was very much backed up by the fact that so many countries didn't need to think existentially about military protection because they got that from the Americans. Whereas you now have, for example, we know that the French are now talking about expanding their nuclear umbrella to other countries. And so I can think of 5 or 6 countries right now, Japan, South Korea, Germany, Poland, Saudi Arabia, who must all be rethinking whether or not they need nuclear weapons. That was never a discussion 24 months ago.
Yes.
And the other thing, Kostas, I would say is that 2 very interesting countries in this regard are Japan and Germany. As a result of the treaty signed in 1945, both countries scaled back greatly on their militarism and committed to do so for the foreseeable future. Well, we now have a situation where we know that the Germans are spending more money on defense. We also know that the Japanese industrial giants like Mitsubishi Heavy are starting to entertain discussions from organizations like NATO and from individual countries as to whether or not they can switch from making consumer electronics and cars into making fighter jets and tanks. And so I worry about where we once had a very unipolar military alliance. All of a sudden, we're going to have 10, 15, 20 different producers of military equipment, as they did in the past, by the way, Kostas. I think it's easy to forget. 100 years ago, countries like Italy and Sweden were big producers of military equipment. And over the last century or so, that has diminished over time, but I don't think it's difficult for them to ramp that up again. So the withdrawal of the United States from the economic world order, from the military world order, has enormous implications for all of those countries that were part of that sphere of influence. Now, you had another question about, are China ready? I don't think it's a question of whether or not China are ready, meaning that China will do what's best for China. And China will always try and make the case to Europe and to the Middle Eastern countries that they are a better long-term partner than the Americans. And for a long time, you've alluded to the cultural advantages that America has. And they still have those advantages in terms of language and culture. You're right. But at some point, Europe and the Middle East are looking at the Americans saying, given how unpredictable American policy is, those traditional cultural advantages perhaps are not worth the price anymore.
But do you think Americans have always been unpredictable, or is it this current situation with the new government?
The Americans have never been unpredictable like this. Not in terms of, the Americans have been the biggest backers of NATO from day one.
Yes.
I mean, you can argue that the Americans and their relationship with the United Nations was damaged in 2003 with the Iraq War. It was America's relationship with the international community was badly damaged as a result of that war. But their relationship with NATO didn't suffer.
Yes.
And the Americans have always been very predictable.
Yes.
There's never been a question about American commitment to NATO. I don't think. Certainly, presidents like President Obama tried to encourage Europeans to spend more on military budgets. But Costas, I think there's an important distinction there, meaning that if you're spending 2% of your GDP on defense, like Germany were, and if American president says, I'd like you to put it to 2.5, that increase is not worth changing your economic structure for, and therefore you'll just buy a bit more American equipment. If it needs to go from 2% to 5% of GDP, now all of a sudden you're saying, you know what, we're going to keep all that money internally and rebuild our own military industrial complex and stop buying American equipment. So whereas President Obama was asking them to spend a bit more effectively on American equipment, the current administration is pushing all of these countries to develop their own weaponry, which again, economically is not good for the Americans.
Yes. Yes. So inflation is certain to be with us for a few years because it takes time for energy to restart and get distributed. We have the minerals as well, which have a problem. They have to restart. So we are really going for a world recession. Do people realize that, the important people who take decisions, the politicians?
I think elected officials in democracies don't think much beyond their next term, Costas. Now, democracy versus non-democracy, there are arguments on both sides. Certainly, I think that democracy is going through a difficult period. And my own preference would be to live in a democracy, but I want to be very respectful to those countries that I can think of who are not democracies, who do well and deliver for their people. So democracy is not the only way to deliver for your people. I don't think anything is certain, though, meaning that if you get a strong enough recession, that might take care of inflation. So, you know, if you have an absolutely brutal recession, we might even have deflation. But certainly, one thing you alluded to there that not enough people are talking about is that alongside energy prices is the price of corn, wheat, and soybeans, which are all extremely high. And an American family, a European family, an Asian family, it's very difficult to feed your family without using corn, wheat, and soybeans, whether you realize it or not. Corn syrup is in an awful lot of things. Soybeans are in an awful lot of things. Also, soybeans feed animals, so it affects the price of meat. And I watch those markets quite closely because we're involved with those markets. But the big three grain contracts in the US, which is wheat, corn, and soybeans, are all at very high levels. Costas, yesterday we had a record high in copper, copper is not really a speculative asset like gold. Copper is very much an industrial asset. And so if the price of copper is going up an awful lot, that's going to impact cars, phones. A lot of railways use copper on their railway lines, and that's going to affect price of development there. So there's a lot of different places where I see sources of inflation that are not yet front and center in the news.
Can you put your finger on a number of inflation rate that could hit us in the next 2-3 years? Is it going to be like the 1970s after the oil increase then, that threw everything out? I mean, are we going to exceed inflation 10%, reach 20%? Can you imagine?
I don't think we are, for the simple reason that there's only two outcomes, in my opinion, to the current situation in Iran. One outcome is that the Americans have a ground invasion. I think that's very unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
So the second option is that the Americans sign a bad deal for them, which I think is very likely. I think the Iranians are going to win this negotiation, Costas. And I think they're going to squeeze the world economy for the next 3 or 4 months. But at some point, the Americans are going to give the Iranians a good deal. And so that'll prevent inflation, and the Iranians will agree to open the straits and all the rest of it. However, so that means I don't think we'll go above 10% inflation. But certainly I can see us getting to 6, certainly. And because let's say they make this agreement in, let's say, September.
Yes.
As we get closer to the midterms and as countries in the Middle East get more desperate, and these are countries that have an influence on America, then I think the Americans will be forced to do a very bad deal. You see, I think the challenge for the Americans is that there's an expression I love, which is the Americans have the clocks, but the Iranians have the time. And I don't see the Iranian position getting weaker unless their economy absolutely collapses. But I even then, the Ayatollahs seem to have a pretty firm grip on Iranian political, economic, and military life. And it seems to me that their grip has only strengthened in the last 2.5 months. I also cannot prove this, but I believe they're getting all sorts of help from the Chinese and the Russians. I don't see how the Americans are going to win this negotiation. And so I think the net result will be a bad deal that prevents inflation from getting too high, but still inflation will be, could hit 6%, yeah.
Well, you have been known for being a gentleman and a scholar because you always express a sincere view and you get it right most of the time. From what you're saying,
that's very kind of you.
From what you're saying, some people will get worried now, some others happy. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you. We could be talking for hours. Do you want to add anything, or the conclusion is what has this discussion offered to people? It has enlightened them on what matters. That the problem is going to have inflationary forces, definitely. You are saying it's not going to exceed the 10%, which is good, but it will be a few years, 2, 3, 4 years before we recover from this, at least, would you say?
I would agree with that, but I think in terms of, I think I would add that geopolitics moves very, very slowly. It takes 50 years for an empire to fall. And so, if people have concerns, there's always time to make a plan. But things are changing. Okay. Well, it was great talking to you again. You too. Thank you very much. Let's hope for the best. Thank you very much. That's all we can do. Thank you. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.